When we speak of Donald Trump, we are not merely speaking of a political figure or even a former president of the United States. We are, in truth, speaking of a symbol, one that embodies the profound polarization of leadership in our age. The world does not simply see him as a man, it sees him as an idea, and that idea splits down the middle of societies, families, institutions, and even within the hearts of individuals themselves. Some regard him as the embodiment of strength, a disruptor of stagnant systems, a voice that dares to challenge the so-called elites who have long governed the narrative of politics and global affairs. Others see him as a destabilizing force, a divisive figure whose presence erodes civility, undermines long-standing alliances, and replaces cooperation with conflict. This is the paradox of Trump, a leader whose identity is less about policy and more about perception, less about governance and more about the psychology of leadership itself. If we step back, what becomes striking is not just how Trump is judged, but how those judgments reflect deeper fractures in the way human beings now conceive of authority. Leadership has always been contested, but rarely in modern history has it been so emotionally charged, so intimately tied to identity. To support Trump is not merely to endorse a politician, it is to declare an allegiance to a vision of power, a philosophy of governance, even a worldview about how society should function. To oppose him is not simply to criticize a policy, it is to reject an entire ethos of leadership. In this way, Trump exposes the raw nerves of our collective psyche. He brings to light the uncomfortable truth that leadership, in the modern age, is not primarily about what a leader does, but about what a leader represents. Across the globe, the reaction to Trump reveals this universal struggle. In some nations, he is admired for his unapologetic stance, his insistence on putting national interest above international obligation. Leaders who feel constrained by the weight of global diplomacy often see in him a model of unfiltered willpower, proof that disruption itself can be a form of progress. But in other corners of the world, he is a cautionary figure, a reminder of how fragile democratic norms can be, how easily strong voices can drown out collective reason, and how swiftly division can become the defining characteristic of a people. And so the question lingers, what do we truly want from our leaders? Do we seek the unyielding figure who is willing to burn bridges to protect what he claims is ours? Or do we desire the unifier, the one who may compromise but seeks to preserve harmony? The fact that Trump divides opinion so sharply is less about him and more about us. It is a mirror held up to the world, reflecting our own unresolved tensions about strength and unity, individuality and community, freedom and responsibility. Perhaps this is why Trump matters. Whether one admires him or despises him, he forces us to ask whether leadership in this century will be defined by confrontation or by cooperation. And in facing that question, we are compelled to confront ourselves. For in the end, the greatest division is not between nations or political parties, but between the competing visions of what we, as human beings, believe leadership ought to be. The challenge is not to choose sides in that division, but to rise above it, because the kind of leaders we elevate ultimately reflects the kind of people we choose to become. When we examine the phenomenon of Trump beyond the borders of the United States, what becomes evident is that his rhetoric has never been confined to one nation. His unapologetic embrace of nationalism reverberates across continents, stirring debates not only in Washington, but in capitals across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What he articulated so bluntly, America First, was more than a campaign slogan. It was a philosophy, a worldview, and for some, a rallying cry. The world heard it not merely as a domestic policy, but as a signal, a permission slip for others to declare their own versions of "my country above all else." This is why Trump's presence on the world stage is so consequential. For decades, globalization was treated as an inevitability, a tide that lifted all boats, even if unevenly. Yet his words and actions cracked that consensus. By prioritizing sovereignty over interdependence, by questioning alliances and challenging trade deals, he reframed the conversation. Should nations sacrifice identity and autonomy for the sake of global cooperation, or should they reclaim their right to define their destiny on their own terms? For many leaders, especially in countries feeling overlooked or constrained by global systems, this message was not a warning, but an inspiration. They saw in Trump's defiance a model of courage. Proof that one could resist the currents of globalization without immediately drowning. But inspiration for some is provocation for others. Trump's nationalist rhetoric raised fears that the delicate fabric of international cooperation could unravel. If every nation insists on putting itself first, what becomes of shared responsibility? What becomes of climate agreements, trade partnerships, security alliances, those fragile threads that bind the world together? In this sense, his influence is double-edged. On one hand, it revives a sense of self-determination, urging nations to assert control over their borders, economies, and cultures. On the other, it risks dragging the world backward into a state where mistrust replaces cooperation and where suspicion defines international relations. At a deeper level, the rise of nationalist rhetoric under Trump forces us to wrestle with an ancient human tension, the pull between belonging and independence. Every community, every nation, longs to preserve its uniqueness, its story, its identity. Yet at the same time, survival often requires partnership, compromise, and trust. Trump's rhetoric inflames this paradox, sharpening the contrast between us and them, between what is ours and what is theirs. For those who feel dislocated in an increasingly globalized culture, this message resonates like a lifeline. For those who believe humanity's progress depends on solidarity, it feels like a dangerous regression. And so we stand at a crossroads. Trump's nationalism has ignited a global echo, but the meaning of that echo depends on how we respond. Will it awaken a healthier balance between local identity and global responsibility, or will it fracture the bonds that make cooperation possible in an interconnected age? The truth is this nationalism, once reignited, cannot easily be silenced. It is up to us to decide whether that fire illuminates a path toward dignity and self-respect, or whether it burns down the very bridges that connect us to one another. When we turn to the role of media in shaping perceptions of Trump, we encounter something far larger than headlines, tweets, or televised debates. We encounter the construction of myth. Around the world, Trump has not simply been reported on, he has been framed, dramatized, and woven into narratives that present him either as a savior of the forgotten or as a villain threatening the very fabric of democracy. This dual mythology reveals not just something about Trump himself, but something deeper about the way societies now absorb information and form judgment in the age of relentless media saturation. It is striking how rarely the conversation about Trump centers solely on facts. Instead, it is about images, impressions, and symbols. The red cap is not just a campaign accessory, it is a badge, a banner, and to some even a provocation. A single phrase, whether fake news or drain the swamp, is enough to ignite loyalty or outrage across borders. And here lies the philosophical question, do we experience leaders as they truly are, or do we experience the versions of them constructed by the stories told about them? For Trump, this question becomes especially pressing because the gap between reality and narrative is perhaps wider than for any modern leader. Media outlets, both domestic and international, amplify this gap. In some regions, he is depicted as the embodiment of boldness, a figure unafraid to defy political correctness and challenge elites. In others, he is portrayed as reckless, dangerous, and incapable of statesmanship. These portrayals are not merely differences of opinion, they are competing realities, each shaping how millions of people understand not only Trump, but the world itself. The same speech, the same policy, the same gesture can appear heroic in one headline and catastrophic in another. In this sense, Trump is not just a man, he is a mirror reflecting the biases, priorities, and fears of the media systems that interpret him. And so, the larger issue emerges, is truth still something objective, waiting to be discovered, or has it become a narrative crafted by those with the power to tell the story? If the world cannot agree on who Trump is, then perhaps what divides us is not him, but the very lenses through which we see. This raises a deeper concern. When our understanding of reality is filtered entirely through media, do we risk living not in truth, but in competing myths? For Trump, this has meant living simultaneously as a symbol of freedom and as a symbol of threat. But for us, it means living in a world where perception wields more power than fact, and where the shaping of public opinion is as influential as the reality it attempts to describe. This is the challenge of our time, to recognize that narratives can inspire, but they can also distort. If we allow ourselves to be governed solely by the stories others construct, then we surrender the very responsibility of discernment. The media may build the myth, but it is we who must decide whether to live inside it or to seek the truth beyond it. One of the most striking ways Trump divided opinion was through his vision of the economy and the role of nations in a global marketplace. For decades, the prevailing wisdom among world leaders was that globalization was not just necessary but inevitable, that free trade agreements, multinational partnerships, and global supply chains would bind nations together in mutual prosperity. Trump openly rejected this assumption. He positioned himself as the champion of economic sovereignty, unapologetically declaring that America would no longer play the role of caretaker for a system that, in his view, disadvantaged its own people. This defiance struck a deep chord at home, where many felt abandoned by industries that had moved overseas or by policies that seemed to prioritize abstract global growth over local survival. But it also sent shockwaves abroad. Allies who had long counted on American leadership in trade were suddenly forced to confront tariffs, renegotiations, and ultimatums. What some saw as courage, the willingness to defend national interests against the faceless machinery of globalization. Others saw as recklessness, a destabilizing challenge to the delicate balance of interdependence. What is important to recognize here is that Trump did not create the tension between globalization and sovereignty, he simply exposed it in a way that could no longer be ignored. Every nation wrestles with this paradox. How do you remain competitive in an interconnected economy while still protecting the dignity of your own workers and the integrity of your own industries? Trump's answer was blunt: choose sovereignty even if it disrupts the system. For some, that was a breath of fresh air, a long overdue correction. For others, it was an existential threat to a world that depends on cooperation to survive. This clash of perspectives speaks to something deeper than economics. It is about how we define fairness and responsibility. Is fairness making concessions so that weaker nations are not left behind? Or is fairness ensuring that one's own people are not sacrificed for the sake of others? Is responsibility a global duty, or is it first and foremost a national obligation? These are not abstract questions, they are psychological and philosophical ones, touching the very core of how we define community, both within borders and beyond them. Trump's economic nationalism, then, is not just about tariffs or trade wars. It is about how the world chooses to balance unity with independence, prosperity with loyalty, and cooperation with competition. And because his stance was so forceful, it compelled other leaders to take a position as well. You could not remain neutral. You had to decide whether his vision represented strength or short-sightedness, liberation or isolation. In the end, Trump forced the world to face a truth it preferred to avoid. Globalization is not a neutral force. It comes with winners and losers, with gains and sacrifices, and with choices that test the moral identity of nations. The question is not whether we participate in the global economy, it is how and on whose terms. Perhaps the deeper challenge Trump leaves us with is this: will we design an economic order that serves both sovereignty and solidarity, or will we continue to swing between extremes of dependence and defiance? The answer to that question will shape not just markets, but the moral fabric of our world. When we come to the question of morality and identity in relation to Trump, the debate moves beyond policy and enters the realm of personality. Few leaders in recent history have blurred the line between private character and public power as profoundly as he has. To many, Trump represents unapologetic authenticity, someone who refuses to conform to the polished language of career politicians, who wears his flaws as proof that he is not manufactured but real. To others, that very authenticity is troubling because it suggests a lack of discipline, a disregard for decorum, and a willingness to bend or break moral standards in the pursuit of victory. This division reveals something deeper about us than about him. It forces us to ask, how much does morality matter in leadership? Can a leader be effective if their personal character is questionable, or does questionable character inevitably corrode the integrity of their office? For some, the answer is clear: results matter more than personality. If jobs are created, if borders are secured, if promises are kept, then the personal life or temperament of a leader is secondary. For others, leadership is inseparable from moral example. A leader's words, actions, and character ripple outward, shaping the values of society and defining the tone of public life. Trump sits at the center of this clash, not because he is uniquely flawed or uniquely virtuous, but because he makes visible what most leaders conceal. He does not attempt to hide his ego, his aggression, or his ambition. In fact, he amplifies them, turning them into tools of influence. And here lies the paradox: qualities that some view as moral failings, others interpret as strengths. His confidence becomes arrogance to one audience, but conviction to another. His defiance becomes recklessness to some, but courage to others. What this reveals is that the measure of morality in politics is not fixed. It shifts depending on what we value most. Do we prize honesty over effectiveness, stability over disruption, courtesy over candor? Trump divides opinion so sharply because he forces people to declare which of these values they are truly willing to stand by. He exposes the tension between ethics and power, between the desire for virtuous leadership and the hunger for decisive action. Yet, if we look at this more philosophically, the question may not be whether Trump meets our moral standards, but whether we, as societies, have become willing to lower or redefine those standards when it suits our interests. In this sense, Trump becomes less of an exception and more of a revelation. He reveals how elastic our moral expectations are when confronted with the promise of security, prosperity, or victory. That is why his impact cannot be measured only in policies or elections. It must also be measured in the moral compromises societies are willing to make in the pursuit of power. And this should concern us because history reminds us that once the bar of morality is lowered in politics, it rarely rises again on its own. The true test of our time is not whether we judge Trump's morality rightly, but whether we hold ourselves accountable to the standards we claim to value. For in the end, the moral compass of a nation is not set by its leaders alone, it is set by the people who choose them. When we consider Trump's legacy, it becomes clear that what endures is not only a list of policies or a sequence of political events, but a division that has etched itself into the consciousness of nations. His presidency did not merely introduce new debates, it intensified old ones, exposing fractures that had long existed beneath the surface. For some, Trump's legacy is that of a catalyst. He awakened citizens who felt voiceless, he disrupted structures that many believed were untouchable, and he forced uncomfortable conversations onto the global stage. For others, his legacy is a cautionary tale, proof of how quickly rhetoric can inflame division, how fragile institutions can be when tested, and how easily unity can give way to discord. This duality is precisely what makes his impact so difficult to define. He cannot be remembered simply as a failure or as a success, because his influence is not confined to one dimension. It is social, cultural, psychological, and generational. The fact that he divides opinions so sharply ensures that his presence will continue to shape political discourse long after his time in office. The debates he stirred are not fading. They are being inherited by future leaders, future voters, and future societies. What makes Trump's legacy particularly significant is that it challenges us to confront the deeper question of what division itself does to humanity. Division is not inherently destructive. Sometimes it can be the catalyst for reform, the force that compels societies to reevaluate their values and correct their course. But division can also harden into hostility, creating tribes that no longer see one another as opponents but as enemies. Trump's legacy, then, is not fixed. It depends on how we respond to the division he leaves behind. Do we treat it as a spark that ignites renewal, or do we allow it to fester into permanent fracture? Philosophically, this asks us to reconsider the nature of leadership itself. Should a leader be judged by the unity they preserve, or by the courage with which they challenge the status quo? Can we accept a legacy of division if it awakens long suppressed truths, or do we insist that true leadership must leave behind harmony rather than turmoil? These questions are not theoretical, they are moral decisions that every society must make. Trump's story reminds us that legacies are never neutral. They either guide us toward wisdom or warn us against repeating mistakes. And perhaps his greatest influence is not in the answers he gave, but in the questions he forced us to ask, questions about truth, loyalty, morality, and the price of power. The challenge for us is to decide whether we will use those questions to deepen the divide or to build bridges across it. For in the end, the measure of Trump's legacy will not be written by him, but by us, by whether we allow division to define our future, or whether we rise above it to define our own.